The Destruction of Black Civilization, Part 7. The Scattering of the People, Routes to Death and Resurrection. The African migrations have been stressed at various points as one of the major developments from which so much can be learned about the history of black people. The migrations explains many things. They were people in perpetual movements. The movements were human tragedies spanning to many millenniums. It was noted that the great pressures on the Africans actually began in the prehistoric times, and that the pressures that uprooted so many settled communities came from two principal agents of destruction: the slow and relentless incursions of oceans of sand, and the slow and relentless incursions of Asian hordes. The Europeans coming later accelerated the movements. Migrations as cultures declines. The migrations were many different kinds, and so much that the overall description of them is often misleading. There was no general, continuous fight of people here and there all over the continent. Some of the movements were slow and limited in space that one might hesitate to call themselves migrations. These were the groups that moved only a relatively short distance each time, and as a whole, never left their general area. After 100 years, such groups might not be more than 100 miles from their traditional home after several generations. Even in these cases, of those who migrated farthest, the movement had been slow because the whole movement was forced. Every breakup and painful uprooting of communities that had built on hopes and dreams of a permanent abode. Every move was a search for still another abode where land and water could support life and security could assure another chance of survival. These slow movement migrations were mentioned in the discussion of geographical influences. There were also the better known migrations that erupted and moved south, east, and west like tidal waves. These occurred as the result of many Asian and European invasions and conquests. They were further accelerated by the new turn in the institution of slavery from the 7th century AD onward. At a much later period, after the 16th century, black marauding groups such as the Jaga and the Ngoni added to the turmoil and disorganization. It is quite clear that the waves of blacks that spread over Africa in these migrations came mainly from the area where black concentration was the greatest, and the attacks on the concentration preserved relentlessly. This area of black concentration of population was the ancient Ethiopian Empire, which I have described as the heartland of the race, the motherland, with a civilization that, despite the Asian invasions, still included all Upper Egypt in 3100 BC and extended southward over the Sudan across Abyssinia. But everywhere the people from the birthplace of black civilization wandered, they found, almost without exception, people already settled, some having preceded them by decades or centuries, and others who had been there according to their ancestor story since the beginning of time. Such, for example, was the tradition of the Kete and the Siwa people in Central Africa. The inter-tribal wars and the intense tribalism that developed from them are among the fateful outcomes cited in the connection with the migrations. I have stated a number of times that inevitably there were non-blacks in the migrations, as they were, in one way or another, integrated with Africans and participated with them in other developments. This meant that there was always a number of predominant black groups with some Asians and mulattoes who were as loyal to the race as any black. This is the kind of fact that blasts any attempt to indict a whole people or put them into a single category. Human beings simply refuse to be generalized in neat categories. In ancient times, and even later, there were Caucasians who regarded the blacks as superior people. The question about inherent inequality they would have thought absurd to entertain. The Greeks, who seem to have studied the advanced civilization of black people, were more than any other white people, were first in this group to admit that. There were therefore always Caucasians who were affectionately drawn to the blacks as by some magic. When recognized as a genuine by the blacks, the esteem became mutual, and such Caucasians became an integral part of some black groups. These were not the Caucasians, Asians, or Westerns who infiltrated black societies for domination and future conquest. These were the Caucasians, albeit a small minority, who stayed with the blacks and fought shoulder to shoulder with them against their own kind, retreated with them in defeat, and were therefore a part of the migrations. I have also emphasized that not all of the mixed breeds, whether Afro-Arab or Afro-European, deserted the blacks for whites. For a while, the majority did cleave to the race of their fathers. The devotion of the minority to the race of their mothers seemed to be so spiritual in nature that it more than overshadowed the white worshiping of half-whites. And what has all this to do with the migrations? The answer, almost everything. Much of the history of Africa has been written by anthropologists. They have written it within the theoretical framework of their own ethnology, and historians and others have relied almost entirely on their classifications of people. The usual claim that history is a science is made despite the amount of pure guessing that characterizes its conclusion. Racism is so obvious in most of the anthropological findings that one may wonder how, if they hope to maintain the fiction of being scientific, it could escape their notice. It has been suggested that their bias does not in fact go unnoticed, but they are so certain of the favorable reception by the white audience to which they address themselves that what others outside of that world think is a matter of consequence. These latter do not supply the millions that support their African studies. The main thrust of their findings is to make Africa Caucasian from the beginning of its history and to give the blacks not just a subordinate role, but no significant role at all in history. Hence, the great emphasis on the Caucasoid identity of this or that African tribe, and two, failing that in a highly advanced all-black situation where no such classifications could be made, to alleged Caucasian influence in one way or another. This record does not require debate. It meets the eyes in the most of the books by these Africanist experts. There should be no confusion over Negroid types or Caucasoid types, where there was such a widespread mixing of races as was the case in Africa. As elsewhere from the earliest times, it becomes even more ridiculous when it is established that the certain Caucasians have Negroid features without the benefit of having any Negroid blood, and conversely and controversially, many of the blacks have physical characteristics which are supported to belong to Caucasians only. In line with their presumption in taking over the continent and reordering its radical composition, the anthropologists and their historian followers have declared that the true Negroes, black Africans, are concentrated in West Africa only. With one wave of the magic wand in all their powerful scientific hand, they changed the biblical story that the black race descended from Ham through his son Cush. The plain fact that the land of Cush was ancient Ethiopia itself, and that the Cushites were blacks simply ignored, and Cushites were reclassified as Caucasians. The whites and half-whites who were allied with black groups and migrated with them are singled out as the determining elements in whatever the groups achieved. Even in the planting of crops and irrigation techniques, the Asiatic Caucasians, who are known to have settled along the northern and eastern coast of Africa, even in prehistoric times, are now being presented as the indigenous inhabitants. That archaeologists would find Caucasoid a matter of course, nor would I think it surprising if excavations discovered Caucasoid skeletons several thousand years old anywhere in Africa. The same unshocked attitude is maintained when Negroid types were discovered on the British Isles. Indeed, Negroid remains have been found in other places in Europe and distant lands where no blacks were have known to live, not to mention the millions known to have settled outside of Africa. Therefore, instead of postulating a theory of history that, on the basis of a few skeletal remains, a whole people inhabited an area first, it would be more sensible to conclude that the members of this or that race certainly had visited or settled in the area a long time ago, some dying there, away from their own native land. But suppose they did come as permanent settlers, such as the Dutch in South Africa and British in Rhodesia. The whites of South Africa are not waiting for the certain verdict of anthropologists and historians in their favor. They already claim to be the original inhabitants, saying, as George Peter Murdoch and his school proclaimed, that the Africans came into the land later. 1,000 years hence there would be no dearth of Caucasians remaining in Africa. I just referred to George Peter Murdoch. All through these discussions I have been unsparing in my criticism of Caucasoid scholarship at various points. I have, in effect, accused them of the subtle thievery of the achievements of an important division of the human race, deliberate and unconscionable. To understand the basis for this criticism, one need not match my labor by wading through over 100 books. One good example of all that I have been saying in this connection will suffice. The example of Murdoch's Africa, its people, and their culture. For here is another one of those works which is replete with all the trappings of profound scholarship, bearing, as all such works invariably do, the mark of scientific objectivity. Yet from beginning to end, Murdoch maintains his central theme: Africans are not in fact Africans. Black civilization was not in fact black civilization. Countless peoples thought to be Negroes by many, such as the Bushmen, the Maasai, Cushites, Pygmies, even the Bantu, are of Caucasoid origins. And while his own account of migrations often contradicts his main thesis, this, I suppose, he dismisses as simply unavoidable. He was at his racist best in a specious and rather amusing argument that attempted to prove that even the Asians were not blacks. It is not significant that so many white writers spend so much time and energy trying to make this or that person or group non-African. Certain direct consequences of the migrations will not be fully understood unless the many centuries they slowly covered are kept in mind. The development and spread of the numerous languages, dialects, separate and independent small city-states from which varieties of cultural patterns inevitably emerge. These outcomes highlight the factors of segmentation in the decline of advanced black institutions, but migrations from the first centers of black culture in the Sudan and Egypt had beneficial results also. The migrants were a new kind of missionaries. They carried whatever they could find of their advanced civilization wherever they went, and they carried it far and wide. The backward groups that had been living far away from the centers of progress were the beneficiaries. An economic revolution occurred in areas where the Nile migrants not only brought new grains and crops, but also new implements and farming techniques. They also spread the gospel of industrial production through the expansion of crafts and their organization into guilds. The greatest of them was born from iron, created the greatest industrial revolution in Africa, and became at once both the catalyst and foundation of the new state formations and expansions of power. In like manner, basic African institutions such as the traditional constitutional and social systems were reinforced by the migrations from the heartland. And while many of these basic institutions were influenced and modified by Islam and Christian Europe, they all remain so unyielding at the core that they can be studied today almost as directly as they could have been 5,000 years ago. There is another fact in this connection that is not pointed out often and never stressed. We generally speak glibly enough about Asian and Western influence on Black Africa, but seldom about the influence of Africa on Asian and Western institutions. The process of Africanization began at once whenever the blacks came in contact with foreign institutions. Both Islam and Christianity had to yield to Africanization. Even autocratic sultans and emirs, all powerful in Asia, clashed head-on with the constitutional role of the council in Africa and had to yield. The religions that spread most rapidly and widely were those which were readily adaptable to African cultural patterns. Islam and the Catholic Church led in this, and the Catholic Church outdistanced every other Christian domination in growth. A large volume should be written on the African influence on both Asian and Western civilization, since that influence began in ancient times, was not limited to Caucasian on the African continent, but was carried to other lands by migrating whites who themselves had been Africanized. African values did not die even among the millions of slaves who were transplanted to distant lands. In the United States, where the system to stamp out every vestige of black culture was most thoroughgoing and relentless, African traditions persisted and influenced not only the white slave-owning class, but the course of American civilization itself. The historical significance of the movement of people, no matter under what circumstances, can hardly be overemphasized. We have seen how and why the flight of blacks from the Sudan increased as the Arab hordes continued to sweep in the 13th century, and Islam was more aggressively pushed. Too many blacks leaving the homeland is what was happening, and what's far worse than the sight of their cities, towns, and villages going up in flames, for now they saw their very own leaders, kings, and other notables divesting themselves of a tradition of civilization that went back beyond history into Paleolithic times, and for expediency or self-interest were humbly grasping at the robes of the Arabs, their language, and their religion. Their leaders on their throne were no longer Africans or Ethiopians. They were now of still another race. They were black Arabs. So it did not matter at all that new states were forming under black Arab rule. The Arabs not only tolerate these black Muslim rulers, sultans, and emirs, they were now called, but found it expedient to use them as fronts in controlling the remaining black population. The real rulers were the various Arab tribes that were now scattered all over the Sudan. There was a great difference between these new black Muslim states and Funj. For while Funj was also a sultanate in name, it had a long line of black rulers who steadfastly refused to be Arabized, even to the extent of accepting Arab names, and even the Arab population knew very well that the Muslim religion of black sultans was very superficial indeed. The new French states of Darfur, Wadai, and others under black Muslims offered no place of refuge for those whose very reason for flight was to maintain their own racial identity, dignity, and religion. When we return to the Sahara again, for here is where the first black migrations began before written history. Sahara, or wasteland, indicates what it became, not what it was. It was the largest northern region of the Balad as Sudan, the land of the blacks. Viewing this vast area for at least 5,000 years, it is difficult to believe that it was not forever thus. But the Sahara, far bigger than the United States, was once a land of lakes, rivers, forests, green fields, farms, villages, towns, and cities. Wildlife was abundant. Cattle grazed in meadows, and horse-drawn chariots spread over the highways. It was a great land, yet only a part of an even greater black world. We have already noted that this black African world has been under relentless pressures from the seacoast by invading whites from the earliest times: Hebrews, Phoenicians, Mongols, Arabs, Berbers, Greeks, Romans, etc. It was also pointed out that it is not without significance that even today that most of the invaders occupy the same areas where they first came in, the seacoast. For centuries, these whites must have been received with the traditional African hospitality. They were immigrants, settlers, and traders. Many, like the early blacks themselves, were seafaring men. The blacks were once among the most adventurous of peoples, is evidenced not only by the presence of their descendants in many lands and numerous far-flung lands, but also by archaeological remains found in various parts of Europe. It seems clear, therefore, that the whites were not regarded as invaders with ulterior motives, but as co-partners in the further development of world trade. There was no obvious reason to think otherwise. No particular significance was seen in the fact that the whites always massed along the seacoast and built their own towns and trading posts, strongholds there. The blacks were also in these same coastal areas. There was a general mixing or amalgamation of the races. Also from the earliest times in this area, the offspring of blacks and white Berbers and Arabs became known as Moors, Tuaregs, Tipu, and Fulani. Like Afro-Americans, they were of every conceivable complexion, some of the whitest having Negro blood. The scientists on Africa, however, classify even the dark-skinned in these groups as Caucasoid. It does not appear that any black prophets came forth to warn the trusting African people that over 3 million square miles of their own fertile land would be made a vast wasteland by the slowly moving sandstorms from the north, or that even fleeing their very lives would likewise be made a vast wasteland by the white storms from the seacoast. The sandstorms at first began their long and relentless rampage over hundreds of miles, but only as previously deforesting and the disappearance of grassland made this easy. The dissertation began far back in time, probably during a period well after Quaternary times. No one knows how long the awful process of drying up lakes and rivers lasted. What is crystal clear is that during the ensuing migrations, the blacks made their greatest and most tragic error. It was an error to be fraught with the direst historical consequences for the whole black race. Instead of moving in masse to the seacoast and maintaining the dominant position there, which they could have done easily, they moved in masse toward the interior, first to the remaining oases in the desert and then into northern and southern Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Sudan, and to the south, central, and western regions. The Berbers, Arabs, and their Afro-Asian offsprings, Moors, Tuaregs, etc., now firmly held the entire northern, northwestern, and northeastern seaboard of Africa. This tremendous victory of the white man was not achieved by conquest. It was achieved by default on the part of a race to preoccupy with the immediate present and less with its future, a race whose centuries of blind trust in the white man surpassed all understanding. One might say that in surrendering all of their coastal area to the Asians and mulattoes, apparently without a fight except in the case of Lower Egypt, that the blacks not only sealed themselves off from a world commerce and general international relations, but they also at the same time sealed their own fate to be surrounded, hemmed in, and hunting ground for slaves. The pattern for Egypt and Aksum was clear-cut. The story was already outlined early enough and so clearly that even the blind could not be unaware of the shape of things to come. The shape emerged in their present. The whites were aggressive, always relentlessly pushing for the command position in every situation. No matter how small their number or how significant the project, the blacks, by contrast, were not so aggressive, tending toward the brotherhood approach and generally striking in retaliation for prior wrongs done. This overall humane and essentially religious attitude of the blacks led Arnold Toynbee to say that mankind may have to emulate them if civilization is to be saved. This is hardly a compliment in a word where the very meaning of civilization is lost. In the face of the Caucasian will to power and domination, this religion of meekness is a tactic surrendered to the permanent overlordship of the aggressive and the strong. This is the testimony of history, and perhaps this is why I have always been puzzled by the declaration of Jesus Christ that the meek would inherit the earth. Did he mean the grave? The pattern referred to above developed from the fact that countless thousands of blacks did not migrate anywhere but remained among the Asians. They gradually became the lowest class in society, although there was some mobility of escape routes. These Berbers and Arabs constituted the upper class and ruling group. Next came the Afro-Berbers and Afro-Arabs, mulattoes, also classified as whites, but in a class below whites. And finally, there was still the lower class of blacks, and strangely enough, all Berbers, Arabs, and mixed breeds who chose to cast their lot with the blacks and share their destiny. I said strangely enough, but there was really nothing strange about it. It was simply a human situation. A part of the explanation was that out of the centuries of intermarriages, there had developed a network of family and kinship relationships, but it meant much more than these kinship ties. These whites and half-whites, admittedly a small minority, nevertheless did not have to have themselves classified as blacks, giving up the open opportunity to direct power, fame, and fortune. Like the majority of whites and half-whites with similar ties to the blacks, they could have easily cut those ties and even denied that any ties ever existed. That was the easy way, the self-serving and expedient way. They refused to take it and choose to share all the hardships of the blacks. I dwell on this because here we catch a fleeting glimpse of the progress of the human spirit as it emerged on a plane above the rewards of materialism and self-interest. I dwell on it because wherever this small groups exist in a world going mad with greed, there will remain some faint hope for a more humane world in the next 1,000 years. Social and economic mobility came from the circumstances that the Arabs, that the blacks made up the strongest contingents of the Berber and Arab armies. Some became commanders, others became chief counselors to the sultans. Most males were castrated, however, or removed from possible contact with all females. An equally significant group was the labor force of enslaved blacks. These were highly important because they relieved the white Asians from all labor. The blacks, who were skilled craftsmen in various fields, fared better since they were generally spared from the whip. The plight of the blacks in white-dominated areas, including their enslavement, would have been different if the massive had not scattered in groups over the trackless Sahara, the Nile Valley, Ethiopia, and other regions of the continent. The others referred to were the blacks who remained where they were as their once vast and fertile homeland slowly turned into a Sahara or wasteland. Geologists, archaeologists, and other specialists have advanced various theories to explain the great mystery of the transforming of the Sahara. We need not retell that interesting story here, for every explanation seems to project still another puzzling question. For me, at any rate, for example, just how did the Albion Sea, a vast inland body of water as large as France, disappear in the Sahara? How many cities and towns lie buried under those mountains of sands and rocks? We know that in a given area, all farms, orchards, and even villages could be completely covered over with sand in a matter of weeks. The fierce winds whipped up walls of sand and gravel like mountain ocean waves. Since this region is over 1,000 miles wide and more than 3,000 miles from east to west, most of the people in the interior must have perished with their villages, farms, lakes, and rivers. The exceptions were those lucky people whose farms and villages escaped inundation by the moving oceans of sand. In these places of refuge, later called oases, the otherwise indiscriminate forces of death and destruction did indeed discriminate. Sometimes high walls of sand began to pile up before reaching these sites, leaving them safely in the valleys thus formed. These continued to be the centers of life and hope as the years passed on into our own times. And it is not without significance that 2/3 of the Sahara population today is still black. Like their ancestors, they continue to be settled communities of farmers and craftsmen, the kind of communities where civilization itself is born. But also, like their ancestors and all other advancing people, they were vulnerable to the widely ranging camel-riding Berber and Arab nomads. These tent-dwelling raiders gained absolute control over all the trans-Saharan trade routes. With their kinsmen in control of all of the commercial seaports, they had effective control over the economic life of Africa and therefore Africa itself. The matter of making that the control more complete by raiding and enslaving the blacks in scattered oasis communities became relatively easy. Direct contacts with Europe and Asia meant the possession of the larger superior weapons which the blacks were unable to secure, firearms. The great story of the Sahara is yet to be told. Archaeology has hardly scratched the surface beneath which is a lost civilization lies buried under several thousand feet of sand and rocks. How far westward did the effective rule of the ancient empire extend? How many kingdoms were there, and by what African names were they known? Were the fringe states, such as ancient Ghana, that were found fighting for survival on the edges of the desert, once a part of a vast imperial system? There is some evidence that this may have been the case, but the actual fact remains unknown and speculation becomes an idle pastime. What is known is the migrations from the Sahara, while heavily concentrated in Upper Egypt and the Eastern Sudan, also spread out over Africa, in and through the Western Sudan. I may seem to have overemphasized the ethnic composition of some migrating groups by repeating reference to it, but it is so important that white historians have bypassed it in order to establish a new theory of prehistoric Caucasian occupancy in Africa. Have they not found supposedly Caucasoid remains and artifacts in different places? According to this theory, the whites in their conquest of Africa were simply returning to their own original homeland, but where now is the homeland of the blacks? Our Africanists experts do not know. Some few, apparently seeing how ridiculous was the corner in which they had painted themselves, suggest that perhaps the blacks migrated from India or somewhere in Europe. Others undertake the established Caucasians' priority in Africa by excavating scriptures, which no Negroes could have built. An example is a prehistoric site in Uganda. They found what seems to have been a well-built fortification on earthwork, reservoirs, dams, and irrigation, trenches, and pit dwellings. All this indicated the mass organization and skills of a superior people, such as the Sidamo, for example. Nowhere in East Africa, the author concludes, are Negro peoples, either Bantu or Nilotic, known to have built structures even remotely comparable to these. This, like 1,000 similar false statements about Africa, requires no answer. The facts now are well known, but let us not miss the central point in all of this. The Sidamo people cited this anthropologist as the probable builders of those structures are themselves black Africans, as black and as Africans as are the anthropologists, Bantu and Nilotic groups. I have lived among all three groups. Some of the people in each group are of mixed blood, as a simple matter of course, just as American blacks are mixed. But in their pathological drive to prevent any concepts of unity from emerging in Africa, Caucasian scholars have been relentless in dividing the blacks of Africa into numerous ethnic categories. This grand strategy was designed to make each group feel unique, special, and hostile to all other groups. The development of different languages in the scattered and isolated societies was the most favorable situation for the division of the blacks and the furtherance of hostility among them. None of this was evil deliberately designed. The writing of the history, or rather non-history, of Caucasians from a Caucasian viewpoint was a development of relatively recent times. It followed logically from the 19th century theories of social evolution. Racism, the natural byproduct, now had a scientific basis and as such became an integral part of education itself. This is why Western anthropologists have played the dominant role in shaping African history, from which their viewpoint was the study of primitive people. The migrations, as we have seen, served their purpose well. The picture becomes clear, however, when we know that the black migrations were not always black. Some of these were Afro-Asians, some had a few white Asians, other groups were entirely Afro-Berber or Afro-Arab. These often tended to form an independent ethnic group, keeping to themselves. There were also some groups of Berbers and later Arabs who migrated from Sahara to favorable locations in the interior. So as stated above, since we are here considering the earliest migrations from the Sahara to find Caucasoid remains in any part of Africa today is really without any particular significance. Such finds obvious do not just conclusions reached by many writers, but these experts on Africa are not ignorant of the essential facts and outcomes of migrations. This is certainly true of those who have studied the dispersions and the mixing of peoples over the millenniums. They know, but there is apparently a deeply felt need and urgent and almost desperate compulsion to justify the power position of the white world over the non-white peoples. That white power is so all-compromising makes the task of Western scholarship in particular easy enough. First of all, they are not only supported by the almost limitless wealth amassed from the exploited peoples of the earth, but they also still control directly or indirectly the economic life of every black state today. This is equally true of numerous non-African countries, still poor and begging while their wealth is being drained off to the already rich countries. Secondly, they control world education and science. Scholarship, supported by billions of dollars, far from being independent and objective, has generally served its masters well, becoming arrogant and overbearing in the process. Their most powerful weapon is a single word: science. Having successfully raised science far above religion and the faith of people generally, they may now present almost any proposition or conclusion as scientific and gain wide acceptance. The age has paused when men listened with reverence when it was declared that thus said the Lord. Now, one simply has to say according to science, or most scholars are agreed. Finally, the university spearheaded the final economic triumph of the West over the rest of the world. Science pushed the partnership of big corporate wealth and big government into exciting fields of inventions and discovery. Weapons of universal destruction actually outdistanced the technology of time and space. Who then could question white supremacy? Who dared to challenge viewpoints held by scholars with this awesome array of power behind them? Certainly nothing coming from the blacks required by any consideration. The mind transplant had been most successful as an operation on the blacks. Having lost the honor of full manhood that comes only from the pride of racial worth and identity, the black man's mind generally operates favorably toward his white enemies and negatively toward himself and his kind. No one knows this better than the whites. They have therefore had a free and unchallenged hand in recording the land of the blacks as they saw fit, classifying and naming people, places, and things just as they please. The blacks were non-persons or nobodies in their own land. From one end of the continent to the other, black youth saw great monuments and statues of Europeans only, European and Arab names for African roads, hills, lakes, towns, and city. One youngster whose ancestors had migrated from the north centuries ago stood gazing at the statue of Cecil Rhodes. He's in our school books too, he's proudly informed his parents. The smile left as he asked, but why are our great men forgotten? We never hear about them. As one could answer, there was silence. The particular group belonged to a family that was 2,000 miles from the known original home. This refers to the place that oral tradition declares to be the original home, but we know that the place of the origin, often given in the oral record, means that the place where the group lived for so many generations that the previous home sites during those long drawn out migrations had been forgotten. What they had forgotten, however, was less tragic than their ignorance of some of the well-known facts of the more recent history as a people. The boy had raised important questions they could not answer because they are blacks of Rhodesia. What little history they knew was white Rhodesian history, and this they could learn from Rhodes and to Ian Smith. They did not know that they had been living for generations in the center of what was once the greatest black empires in Africa, nor had they ever heard of the great African leader of that empire, Emperor Mutota. As elsewhere, Rhodesian history began with the coming of the whites, all before that is unknown prehistory. We have been studying those people who were actually migrating from a highly advanced civilization to less advanced regions, or regions not advanced at all, but who continued to rebuild new states until they were destroyed by European invasions. Since a representative number of these states appear in the following pages, a final word should be said about the vast numbers who they found only caves and swamps as places of refuge, and therefore built no states but sank lower and lower into hopelessness, ever-present fears of capture, and a life that was not life but an animal-like struggle to survive. I referred to these before, but all too briefly. They are an inseparable part of the history of the race. Their savage state enables us to measure the distance from the heights to the level where so many of the race had fallen. It also may be to hold recognition on our part that serves as a guidelight on the road to greatness. Call them savages if that pleases you, but these blacks were in retreat before the slave hunter. These blacks had to choose between enslavement for life and that of all of their descendants and freedom. They did not hesitate. They chose freedom, even though it meant the loss of civilization, a civilization which they had in fact already lost. To be slaves of Arabs, Europeans, or Americans simply meant becoming the economic foundation of their civilization and the steady destruction of the civilization of the blacks. So, all hail to the black savages, those noble ancestors who chose both freedom and death in preference to white enslavement. Freedom and death. Once the paths they made in flight could be followed for days by their bloody footprints in the sand, the wind-blown sand had easily covered them up. Later, travelers and slave hunters could determine the various routes of flight by the skeletons found here and there, fallen statues left by those who could not make it on. They were generally disjointed and scattered. Sometimes it was a bony arm protruding from the windswept sands, a leg over there, or a skull seeming to smile peace at night. The bones of the thousands of those who died in flight were never seen. They lay buried forever under the tons of sands and rocks that moved over much of the regions. Masses of the blacks found security in hills that were made inaccessible to both Arabs and Europeans. Such were blacks who isolated themselves in the strongholds of the Nuba Hills. They were never conquered. Throwing back all invading army units, they attempted subjugation and enslavement. Westerners point to their primitive state, to their nude and half-nude bodies, to the somewhat twisted Western mind's nakedness in public and indicative of the savage. The twisted mind becomes evident when the same people do not find it necessary to explain universally of white nudist colonists or naked bodies, not to mention sexual intercourse on public stages and screens. Reference to the noble people, of course, is simple to give still another example of a people who had to make a grim choice between freedom and slavery, choosing freedom even what that choice meant isolation and inevitably retrogression. Blacks, who were among the very first weavers of cloth and makers on earth, could no longer wear clothes. These flights, before the mighty firepower of the invaders, became more general after 1400 AD. Even though guns, after 200 years of development, were still not in widespread use in Africa, only Europeans and Arabs were able to secure a limited supply of these precious and certain to conquer weapons. The blacks had nothing of the kind. Meanwhile, experimentation to improve various types of gunnery and sped up the production was frantically pushed. The successful outcomes of this great venture in firepower was a prelude to the Industrial Revolution that was to change not only the material world, but was left out of the humane nature of man himself. It is not likely that the people were then generally aware that they were being slowly hemmed in from all directions. It is possible that many did feel it without having any exact knowledge of being encircled, although the danger might be several hundred miles away where the hostile seas met the friendly land. Other groups of wandering blacks headed for dismal swamps. Still others dug caves and hillsides. There were those who wandered aimlessly out in the scorching desert and died with their babies strapped to their backs and larger children clutched by their hands. This meant that the bleached skeletons of the little babies and children greeted the eyes as though the additional testimony were needed to show how many of the young were included among those who could not make it even to the barbarianism. All those who survived in these various groups ended up in areas where they could do little more than survive, even if they had not splintered off into small independent societies. Famine and disease would have reduced their numbers anyway. Therefore, as noted elsewhere, there were many firmly united groups that were so large that migrating as a single unit was impossible. Here, the very circumstances that case demanded separation, estrangement, and isolation from the mother society, and the eventual development of several new languages of groups. The disunity among blacks that spread over the whole race often developed from crisis situations from which they had no control in the awful struggle to survive. The millions who found security only in places of extreme isolation in caves, swamps, around a few precious waterholes in deserts and inaccessible hills, none of these people were favored in the chance even to begin the building of their lost civilization. Far from the beginning ashamed of them as savages, this chapter is a salute to them, a salute with pride that says to them, all honor and all glory. Unlike the blacks we know most about, they could not build great kingdoms and empires. Many were far removed even from the fringes of an advancing world, yet they overrode the unceasing attacks of both death and hell and survived, the last line of freedom on the African continent, and they held it against cannon fire to the very end. Even when the colonialism swept over the land, they were never conquered. They had been wise enough to see both Islam and Christianity as just another route to slavery they had fought and died to avoid. They remained steadfast in their own religion and therefore were called pagans, but all of their children were born free, none in Muslim or Christian slavery, and their girls were never dragged off to become slaves in the harems of Arabs or as breeding girls for white men in the West. Finally, I refer to blacks who, though forced to move, never left their homeland region. The noble did not move very far from where they had lived from times immemorial. A far greater number of blacks held on in their ancient center after it was overrun, refusing either to leave or be enslaved. They stayed and battled against the invaders, finally being concentrated in the southern provinces of the Sudan, where the earlier history of the race in Egypt is still being repeated line by line. And this is why it is so easy to understand the history of the blacks and to see very clearly how they were not only forced far back behind the advancing races, but also pushed to the lowest levels of degradation. For that history is still being made today, covertly and openly, for all the world to see. The blacks who are under pressure today in Bagar el Ghazal, Upper Nile, and Equatoria are still fighting for the survival against all conquering colored Arabs, just as their forefathers fought 5,000 years ago. from the Mediterranean and Lower Egypt to where they are now making a last stand. Romantic history? Who needs it? They have been massacred by the hundreds and villages left in ashes, but they fight on. This all-black region is kept isolated and cut off from the developments and higher levels of life seen in the Arab-dominated Sudan. These southern Sudanese have remained, even in 1973, both primitive and pagan, just as their brothers elsewhere had to remain under similar circumstances. It is still the hunting ground for slaves. The blacks had to remain sharply alert at all times, for the modern slave traffic was covert, subtle, and highly often sophisticated. There were no outright aids. The slave agents may appear as employment officers seeking workers or representatives of schools offering free training for nurses, teachers, and various trades. I was told when I was working in this area that these tactics were so successful for a long time because of the extreme poverty and the desperate need for jobs. The fighting that has been going on constantly for 15 years has caused the same kind of migrations as most of those already described. Thousands have been migrating into any country that allowed them to enter. Even in this modern age, many will never see those left behind again. They will scatter and settle among other people wherever they can. They will become lost in the merger, while their brothers and sisters stay behind and carry on the ancient tradition of fighting against overwhelming odds as long as they can stand. In this study, you must have noticed that the past and present are joined. We study our past for the express purpose of learning what things made the race great in the past, what explains subsequent failures and weakness, and what, in the light of that history, we can do now if we have the will. This is what the study of history should mean for African people in particular. Who asks, why is it that the black world is forever uptight over South Africa and Rhodesia, has remained silent about the 15 years of the slaughter of blacks in the Sudan? I have 4 leaders of the resistance. If the southern provinces had ever appealed to the Organization of African Unity for help, we have been begging them ever since it started, was the anonymous reply. Not for arms, but just to use its influence to stop the burning of our villages and the massacre of our people. But you see, the white and brown Arabs actually control the policies of the OAU. For us, this means that they still control the blacks of Africa. Meanwhile, migrants still wander as of old. For them, freedom and independence are yet to come to Africa.